The president wants a made in the USA iPhone. What are the chances that you can actually make that happen?
Well, if you look at the bulk of it, we're doing a lot of the semiconductors here. We're doing the glass here. We're doing the Face ID module here. So there's a ton of it. And we're doing these for products sold elsewhere in the world. And so there's a lot of content in there from the United States.
So what about the whole thing?
We're very proud of it.
Can you make the whole thing
is just the final assembly that you're focused on. And that will be elsewhere for a while.
He makes many of the components here, and we've been talking about it, and the whole thing is set up at other places, and it's been there for a long time. So in terms of cost and all, but I think we may incentivize him enough that one day he'll be bringing that. But he brings most of the stuff. Look, he's not making this kind of an investment anywhere in the world, not even close. He's coming back. I mean, Apple's coming back to America.
Hello, dear listeners, friends, comrades, subjects, citizens, insurgents, fugitives, defectors, dissidents, even the haters and losers. Welcome to Turbulence. My name is Dylan Saba, and I'm here with my co-host, Seamus Malakafzeli, along with our producer, M. Siniza. We're recording from New York City, the center of a world empire that is dying, but so far from dead.
Now, at this podcast, and I assume with much of our listenership, we are ardent believers in the eternal, immutable, and impossible to deny science of historical materialism and Marxism. However, there are certain things within Western philosophy that we seek some adjustments to as relationships with Western society and with colonized societies have changed in the decades since Marx and Engels published their illustrative works. There is a statement by a member of Ansarullah's Politburo that I return to every now and again because it speaks to deep frustrations that I sometimes have when discussing the relationship between the West and their current imperial holdings. This is from September 2024, quote, "The English philosopher John Locke and the French philosopher Voltaire, the most important philosophers of liberal freedom, were slave traders who contributed to companies that traded African slaves. The English philosopher John Stuart Mill, one of the most important pioneers of liberal philosophy, was an employee in the East India Company, which was concerned with administering the British colonies in India. The German philosopher Hegel, who was described as the last of the encyclopedic philosophers and who believed that history is the awareness of freedom, used to say that the inevitable fate of the Asian empires was to submit to the Europeans and that China would one day be forced to surrender to this fate. Even an original writer and philosopher like Marx, who devoted his writings to opposing and dissecting capitalist exploitation, used to justify Western imperialist colonization of the East on the pretext of the shortcomings of the Eastern peoples and that they could not represent themselves and that someone else must represent them. This is the heritage that continues to guide the Western mind in its dealings with the issues of the East in general and the Islamic East in particular," unquote. There are many, many critical and important things that have come out of Western philosophy and Western analysis of economics. But there are, I think, blind spots, however few, that require some new viewpoints, if you will.
Now, what does that economic relationship of imperialism look like for us in the imperial core today? If you spend any time on our particular corner of the internet, or even if you don't, you might be familiar with certain memes or jokes pertaining to a kind of lifestyle and level of consumption that happens in the West, particularly in the United States, but really throughout the Western world. In contemporary parlance, what I am referring to is treatlerism, or the habit of wasteful consumption, ordering various goods and services on demand, buying new cell phones every couple of years, filling one's homes with Funko Pops and other commercial detritus. Now, this is not a Funko Pop's home per se, but this general style of consumption is essentially unavoidable for those of us who live in the West.
Now, there are many obvious and easy examples of modern day applications or websites that take advantage of the unequal exchange, having to do with the gig economy or international shipping. But as we'll talk about in this conversation, there are other less obvious examples that use this kind of labor, things like Claude or even ChatGPT.
The main critique you hear about this mode of living is that it's unsustainable ecologically, which it very much is. But as we get into in this episode, it also raises a fundamental question about the nature of the global economy. How can those of us in the global north afford to consume on that scale? Each of those treats, from the Funko Pop to the iPhone, is the product of a huge amount of human labor. But because the vast majority of that labor is expended in the global south, it is compensated by much lower wages than are paid in the north. And so the result is prices that appear to the treatler as relatively cheap. Why? A mainstream economist would say, well, you in the global north are an extremely productive worker, and so your wages in real terms reflect that productivity. That's why you have the purchasing power to consume goods produced by less productive workers in the south who are paid much less than you are. But that's pretty obviously bullshit to anyone who isn't a mainstream economist.
Since the middle of the 20th century, I would argue a much more compelling explanation has come from left-wing theorists, largely of the Marxist persuasion, people who bring the much more recent and much more unfortunate science of imperialism into the story. One of those theorists was the Greek economist Arghiri Emmanuel, who published Unequal Exchange, a study of the imperialism of trade, in 1972.
The basics of unequal exchange is that wage differential we mentioned earlier, where workers in the global south, or the periphery of the world system, are systematically suppressed relative to those in the global north, or the core. And because of militant border regimes, workers can't simply pick up and move to where the wages are higher, so they're forced to remain where their work is undercompensated. This creates a value transfer that benefits both capitalists and consumers in the core. In other words, the working class of the countries in the core benefit directly from keeping wages down in the periphery. And this structure is held firmly in place by imperialism. Now, these views did not earn Emmanuel many friends, either among mainstream academics or even among the Marxist left in the West, given that the political implications of his work complicated the traditional story of an international working class that could join hands together and rise up against the capitalist oppressors. But the adherents it did earn him were quite impassioned and committed to the political project of anti-imperialism. One such fellow traveler is the Danish writer Torkil Lauesen, our guest for this week's episode.
Torkil has lived a very interesting life. In 1969, he joined the Maoist cadre known as the Communist Working Circle, based in Copenhagen in Denmark, where he specialized in undercover material support work for liberation movements in the Third World, particularly the PFLP. Besides this, he provided political schooling and study groups analyzing the world system for developing strategy and practice, which continued until his cover was blown in 1989. He turned his years in prison into a long field study, writing a master's thesis in political science about the prison system in Denmark. And after being released, he continues his anti-imperialist activism and writing to pass on the experience of his work and about the unequal exchange and the long struggle for socialism. He is a current member of Anti-Imperialist Net and the Arghiri Emmanuel Association, and I think this conversation was very interesting. Before we get into the conversation, we do have a pitch to you, the listener. Turbulence is entirely listener funded. We don't run ads. We don't take money from institutions. And that independence is the foundation of this project. It only exists because of you.
Because we're committed to providing you the in-depth history and present context you need to make sense of each of these topics, these episodes take a great deal of time and effort to produce, from conception to research to editing. It's because we value your time as a listener, and because we want to produce something lasting and useful, that we think this level of effort is worth investing in. But that means we can't quite move as nimbly as we might otherwise like. So in addition to our free public episodes, we're also dropping weekly episodes behind the paywall. That's where we'll be able to respond to events as they unfold in closer to real time, providing our analysis, following up on threads and conversations from prior episodes, and drawing connections across the topics we've covered.
To do all this, we need your support. A $5 monthly subscription will give you access to the bonus feed, our Substack community, and most importantly, you'll make it possible for us to keep doing this work independently week after week. Subscribe today at turbulencepod.substack.com and follow along on Twitter and Instagram at turbulence_pod. We hope you'll join us.
Hello and welcome. Today we are joined by the writer Torkil Lauesen. Torkil is a member of the Anti-Imperialist Net and board member of the Arghiri Emmanuel Association. He is also the author of several books, including the newest book, Unequal Exchange, Past, Present, and Future. Torkil Lauesen, welcome to Turbulence.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation.
So I wanted to start really by getting into the conceptual grounding of your work and how it relates to the history of capitalism. Because something your work raises is the tension between the global character of capitalist accumulation and the political fragmentation of the world into nation states. Capital operates globally, but labor remains politically divided and unevenly incorporated through national states, borders, citizenship regimes, and vastly different wage structures. I'm curious how you think about the relationship between the nation state and unequal exchange. To what extent did the political organization of the world into nation states become a necessary condition for the persistence of unequal exchange and the historical development of capitalism itself?
Yes, that is actually a very precise introduction to the subject. The formation of the modern world system and the genesis of capitalism in Northwestern Europe is one process in which colonialism played a very significant role. From the age of discovery in the 16th century to early colonialism in the 17th and to the first breakthrough of capitalist manufacturing in the 18th century and then to the breakthrough of industrial revolution in the 19th centuries. And the transfer of value, which I consider the essence of imperialism, was necessary and an integrated part of the rise of capitalism in Europe. The silver and coins from Latin America became the coins which stimulated capitalist manufacture and was also the so-called primitive accumulation. The sugar and the coffee and the cacao, tobacco, tea and cotton and so on, all the colonial product produced by slaves and super exploited labor and then consumed in Europe and North America was part of a global accumulation process which polarized the world system into a center-periphery structure of nation states. This transfer of value by colonial exploitation was not only necessary for the birth of capitalism, it became also the historical solution to a contradiction in the mode of capitalism between the size of production and consumption. To be specific, colonialism generated a value transfer which made it possible for the working class in the center by trade union struggle to raise their wages in the center. And this provided a sufficient consumption power to buy the growing amount of produced goods and thereby realizing the profit for capital by the sale. So European colonialism created a geographic coherent world system and developed capitalism accumulating on the global level that polarized the nation state into this core periphery structure because of the value transformation. However, this historical process in the modern world system also created another structure which have created contradiction in real existing capitalism all through the 20th century. So on one side, we have the development of a capitalist economy accumulating on the global scale. And on the other side, we have the creation of a world system which also generated the modern capitalist nation state. This modern state was to be the political framework for renewed development of productive forces. And the modern state was born through a row of wars and revolutions in Europe, all through the 15th century up to the 19th century, the French Revolution and the Napoleon Wars and so on. So the genesis of the modern capitalist state reached its zenith by the 1848 uprisings in Europe, leading to the unification of the Italian and the German modern states. So on one side, we have a world system that have a globalized production, but it was ruled by a world system fragment in hundreds of nation states. And this development has given the capitalist world system a kind of pulse through the recent century between a tendency to economic globalization, driven by the capital on one side, and a struggle by the nation state to maintain their sovereignty and diversity, often driven by left and right-wing nationalism on the other side. We had the economic wave of globalization from 1850 up to the First World War under British hegemony. Then we have the intense national competition of who was going to succeed Britain as the new economic power. This included 2 world wars. And then we have a wave of new globalization after the Second World War, now under US hegemony, but also steadily under pressure from nationalism in form of national liberation struggle in the Third World, and also balanced by the transitional state, which I call them, like the Soviet Union. And then we have this new wave of globalization from the late 70s until the financial crisis in 2007-8, which was launched by capital neoliberalism. But this also produced some negative consequences, which generated a new wave of nationalism, both in the global south and in the global north, leading to the current renewed geopolitical struggle and the decline of globalization in the form of fragmentation of the world market and sanctions and so on. So this economic and political structure generated by the formation of the model world system was the perfect framework for the transfer of value by unequal exchange, because we have this capitalist economy accumulating on the global scale, and we have a political system consisting of national state with the capacity to control movements of labor and regulate labor and working conditions, both in the core and in the south. So unequal exchange on its side became the solution of the contradiction in capitalism between size of production and consumption, and thereby securing a continued development of capitalism. And the economic political structure in the world system and the mechanism of unequal exchange work together in a mutual reinforcing process through the 20th century, polarizing the system in a dynamic ruling center and in exploited periphery with a blocked development. So this is how the unequal exchange got started and developed through the 20th century.
Thank you so much for that incredibly comprehensive summary of the past 500 years or so of world history. Something I really appreciate about your account is that these forces, unequal exchange, capitalist exploitation, don't just necessarily emerge from the commanding heights of the economy as a kind of self-directed force on behalf of the capitalists. They really emerge out of capitalism itself and out of the state form as a way to mediate or perhaps even resolve or push towards a resolution these contradicting forces that you're naming. The global tendency towards accumulation or drive for accumulation, and also the fragmentation of the world into nation states, and those each possessing individualized national interests. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's important, right? Because when we talk about capitalism or building towards an anti-capitalism, I think there is a tendency to view that as being as against the agents of capitalism, the particular politicians or the particular capitalists, when it really is itself a systemic problem, systemic challenge to overcome. So something that you've mentioned already and is in the title of your books is this idea of unequal exchange. And I think it's worth just really spelling out for our listeners what that means, really. I mean, I think we can root this in the work of Arghiri Emmanuel. And I think it would be helpful to hear a bit about him, about what his particular intervention was into the theory of political economy, and perhaps a bit about how it differs both from kind of classical liberal understandings of political economy, but also the contemporary Marxist ideas that he was intervening in at the time.
Yes, I would like to answer it by my own or my group's affiliation and interest with Emmanuel. In 1966-67, our group developed a theory called the parasite state theory. And it was a theory which should explain the capitalist welfare state in Scandinavia, how this capitalist state was part of the imperialist system, and it was established by riding on the wave of the big colonial powers. Scandinavia was integrated into the capitalist system. And we wanted to expand this theory of the parasite state into the political economy, given it a political economy foundation. And as we were Marxist, Leninist, and Maoist, we of course turned to Lenin's book, Imperialism as the High State of Capitalism, and we tried for a year or two to update Lenin's book on imperialism. And in that process, we found out that actually the profits from foreign investment didn't have the size to explain the polarization of the world system and the difference in living standard in the global north and in the third world. So we looked after other kinds of development in political theory of imperialism. And they were very, very, there were many things in the early 70s. There were Baron and Sweezy, there was Andre Frank, there were Samir Amin, there were Pierre Chalet, and there were also Arghiri Emmanuel. And the reason why we liked him was that he shared very much our view on the position of the working class in Northern Western Europe and in US. And this was very, very rare in the 70s. It was a very, very unpopular position, and it didn't make us many friends, and it didn't make Emmanuel many friends. But this was an attraction for us that he had the shared view. And also when we read his book Unequal Exchange, it was very, very linked to Marxist value theory. And his book was a kind of writing a volume of capital on trade and international economy. So we approached him. We was also very attracted to him because he was not an ordinary academic. He was an activist himself. He had been active in the Greek Civil War, and he actually got a death sentence because of his opposition to ruling Greek regime during the war. And he was put in a concentration camp in Sudan, a British concentration camp for Greek communists in Sudan. But luckily he was pardoned and released. And he has lived nearly 20 years in Belgium, Congo also, and was related to Patrice Lumumba and was an economic advisor to Patrice Lumumba. He was 50 years when he finally ended up in Paris. He was kicked out of Congo by the settlers in 1967 during the Congo crisis. And he couldn't return to Congo, so he began to study socialist planning. At 50 years at Sorbonne, I think he was planning to going back to Congo. He hoped that Lumumba would prevail and he could assist him, but Lumumba was killed and Congo went another way, so he couldn't return to Congo. And then he started all the ideas he had about the political economy of imperialism. He could very, very fast write down to his thesis of unequal exchange, which was published in 69. So this is the history about unequal exchange, but it's very firmly rooted in Marxist theory. In the book, I explain unequal exchange by following the cell in capitalism, the commodity as it unfolds in its complexity in capitalism through the production and circulation process in international trade. And in this way, I follow the structure also in capital. The cell in capitalism is the commodity, and it is defined, its DNA is the contradiction between use value and exchange value. But not only does the commodity have this dual character in the form of use value and exchange value, the exchange value itself has also a dual representation. Its magnitude can be measured in two distinct different ways. Externally, it is the market exchange ratio between commodities. In capital, it's 2 coats in exchange for 1 share, which is equivalent to amount of money, say $100, a market price. But intrinsically, the value can also be measured in the quantity of social necessary abstract worker, in the number of hours it takes to produce it. It can be measured in blood, sweat, and tears, actually. So the two representations of exchange value expressed as money are the price of a commodity and the wage for the labor time needed to produce it. So what I do in the book is that I follow these two representations of exchange value, the prices of commodities and labor time, up through the complexity of capitalism. The exchange value of a commodity as cost of production and production price and market price, and into the global prices. And on the other side, I discuss the different proportion of labor time in all its facets of intensity and skills and productivity and so on. So in the history of capitalism, we can see the development of two distinct differences and a distance between the two representations of exchange value. We see a tendency of global prices of accumulation and a huge difference in prices of wage level. Because of this, we mentioned before, we have a global structure of economic which accumulates on the global level, and we have the different nation countries with different wage levels because the world system is fragmented into different nation states.
So you talked a little bit at the beginning there about a potential parasite state theory in regards to Denmark and the Scandinavia. And I'm wondering if you could maybe expand on that a little bit. Like in a country where they aren't sending soldiers off to Vietnam, or there aren't Israeli weapons manufacturers, what does direct action in that kind of society in particular look like?
Denmark and Sweden and Norway have always actually been part of the imperialist system. Denmark, by its merchant fleet, played a big role in early merchant capitalism as a transporter of colonial goods, but also of slaves. Denmark actually had a colony in Ghana on the west coast of Africa, and it transported slaves to colonies in the Caribbean. Denmark had, at the time, the Virgin Islands were Danish. We sold them to America in 1910, but at the time they were Danish colonies. I think we transported more than 100,000 slaves. I think we were the third or fourth biggest slave transporter. But also in many other ways, Denmark played a significant role. You know, Denmark is mainly an agricultural country at the time before the breakthrough of capitalism. And actually, capitalism got its breakthrough in Denmark through agriculture because we supplied the English market when rises of wages began in England in the second part of the 19th century. The English working class began to buy more milk and butter and bacon and corn also, and this was exported from Denmark. So the English market for agricultural products generated a breakthrough of capitalism in Denmark because it needed infrastructure in form of railways and harbors and also modern dairy machinery and so on to export this market. But also in another way, we have an East Asian company, which also a merchant ship company, which, for instance, it did not only transport colonial goods, it also made its own factories and its own production in Siam, Thailand now. It cut forests down of teak wood and transported it to Europe in the late 19th century. Huge amount of teak, and where they have cut down the teak forest, they planted soya beans, and then they took these soya beans back to Denmark to feed the pigs, which were made into bacon and exported to England. So you have this full circle of exploitation in Thailand of raw materials, and they were processed in Denmark and exported to the hegemonic power at the time. So you have this totally integration of Denmark in the imperialism in that way. And it generated a welfare capitalism in Denmark very early in the 20th century. And the same for Sweden. Sweden was more hooked up to German imperialism, but more or less they had the same development. So there was really no radical revolutionary communist party in Denmark. They existed in Germany, but not in Denmark. The socialist movement in Denmark was very much rooted in the trade union, and they became soon incorporated in the social democratic parties.
I think it's interesting what you're describing here, because it's not just a system in which some of these peripheral capitalist players are complicit in the system of capitalism, but actually they play this very essential role. And one thing that I took away from your theoretical work and the work of others, such as, Jarius Banaji, who's a kind of, intervener in the transition to capitalism debate, is that the role of merchant capitalism it's not just a side player to production. Part of what you're arguing is that value itself in the capitalist system is realized, at least in part, in the process of exchange. Without exchange, the valorization process necessary to capitalist production simply does not happen. And so I think that's important for thinking about what the role is of some of these players in capitalist production that are really intervening at the level of exchange and at the level of the market. It's kind of just as fundamental. And I'm curious if that kind of theoretical intervention shapes how you think about political action. right? The kind of trade union movement is really about realizing worker agency at the site of production. But we've seen all kinds of political interventions at points of exchange or at choke points in the world economy. And yeah, I'm just curious how you see the connection between that theoretical intervention that you and your fellow travelers are making and the questions around political action.
Yeah, it's correct that, and especially unequal exchange have been criticized for arguing that exploitation takes place in the circulation where, hey, you have to remember that value is generated in the productions where by labor. And I think this is a rubbish. Value is generated in the process of a capitalist accumulation process as a whole. Marx was very clear about the relationship between production and circulation in accumulation of capital. He says that capital cannot arise from circulation, and it is equally impossible for it to rise apart from the market. Yes, human labor in production process is the source of value, but value is not a physical substance which is added to the product in the process of labor. We can neither touch or see value as such. We can only touch and see commodities that have value. And value is not an intrinsic quality which have to be injected into the commodity by labor. And Marx again say that no chemists have ever discovered exchange value either in a pearl or in a diamond. The ultimate taste of value actually is the market. Whatever can be sold is a commodity, and value becomes an exchange value on the market. In the sphere of production, value is only a possibility. No sale, no value. So the term of exchange value was not chosen randomly by Marx. Labor is the source of surplus value, but the dream of profit can only be realized in the commodity that are sold. And so also we can see, as you mentioned, that the agents which are in the exchange sector in accumulation in harbors most prominently have often been very active in the struggle against imperialism and capitalism. Dock workers play a very significant role in this struggle.
So you mentioned a little bit ago that these discussions that you were having with political colleagues in the late 1960s, and you were all Marxists, Leninists, Maoists, and this was happening when you were in your late teens or your early 20s. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious if you could speak to how you came into this ideological grounding where the third world was so prominent in your worldview.
Well, I was mobilized in the late 60s by the Vietnam War, as many, I think, of youth today are mobilized into anti-imperialism by the Palestinian struggle. And actually, anti-imperialism played a huge role in this 68 uprising in our part of the world. And as I was coming from a middle-class background, my family at that point of time in the beginning of the 60s moved out of social housing into their own villa. They bought their first car. We got a refrigerator and a television. In 68 was not an uprising caused by poverty or economic crisis. It happened in the midst of the development of the welfare state. So it was so obvious for me that on one side you have this liberation struggle, an anti-imperialist struggle going on in the third world, and I was living in a part of the world in which the welfare state unfolded. This difference was mind-blowing for me, and the connection between what was going on in the third world and what was happening in my part of the world was imperialist exploitation. So therefore, this was obvious for me to take this position at the time.
So could you talk about how other European socialists were interacting with the PFLP in the 1970s? Like, was the Communist Working Circle, the group that you were with, were they unique among Western European groups in contrast to groups in the Eastern Bloc, like the Red Army faction, who were extensively working with the PFLP?
Yes, for sure, because we considered ourselves, we have this analysis of the world of the parasites theory and the contradictions between the third world and our part of the world as our main position. And our idea was to support the liberation struggle in the third world as best we could materially, because then they could develop into some kind of socialist state which could liberate themselves also economically from imperialism. They could cut off the pipelines between the third world and our part of the world, and in that way they will create an economic crisis and a political crisis in our part of the world, which would create some kind of revolutionary situation in our part of the world. We did not consider that our part of the world was mature for revolutionary action, which obvious the Rote Armee faction did. We didn't think that our part of the world was some kind of prairie which we could ignite. For us, our part of the world was a damp meadow which have to be dried out before we could start this kind of work. So the idea with our strategy was to support the Third World Liberation Movement by our undercover support work. We didn't make proclamations about our illegal operation that we appropriated this money for the third world. It was undercover operation as normal crime, because we knew if we make this kind of proclamation, we will be hunted down, because we were not fish in the water. In Denmark, there was no support for this kind of struggle, and we didn't think we could be a pedagogic example to follow. So there was a huge difference between our strategy and our tactics, in that we consider ourselves as simple support workers for the time being for this struggle. And we have no plans at the time for political action in terms of the Danish state.
I love that metaphor of a damp meadow that needs to be dried out. So, but part of your, I know you're saying you're not taking action with respect to the Danish state, but you were expropriating some funds, and that action did wind up with your imprisonment. I'm curious if you can speak a bit to your experience in prison and how that shaped your political and intellectual development.
We didn't feel ourselves as political prisoners because our operations have been criminal, and so we were, in our interrogation with the Danish state, we were criminals. If I have been jailed or imprisoned in a third world country, in Israel or anyone, I would have been a political prisoner. But that we were imprisoned in Denmark, we consider ourselves as normal prisoners. So we participated in the normal activities of prisoners' struggle. On the personal level, I redefined myself from a prisoner to a student on a long field study of studying the prison system. And actually, I used the time to make a lot of interviews and observation about the prison system and turning it into a master thesis, actually, about the modern prison system. So I used a lot of my time, some of my time in the prison to study the prison system and write about this, and also participating in the different struggles in the prison for prisoners' rights. But it was also a time to reconsider our policy and our strategy, because I was in prison in the 90s, and this was a time of the total decline of anti-imperialist struggle, and we were entering neoliberal globalization and a unipolar world system totally dominated by the US.
I want to follow up on that, that kind of historical transition towards U.S. unipolar power and neoliberalism, and kind of ask how you see that as impacting the regime of unequal exchange. Because one of the key precepts of the theory is that the world, at least the modern capitalist world, is characterized by the free flow of capital at the same time that the flow of populations, the flow of labor, is heavily restricted. And part of that is the reason why you can have these differentials between wages and prices that form the basis of unequal exchange, because you have prices set at the global level, but workers cannot move freely to be able to even that out. So I can imagine a story of the Cold War, right, that has the United States acting as a kind of grand, and kind of Western Europe more broadly, as a grand enforcer of unequal exchange, right? The fight against communism in reality looks like the suppression of worker movements across the global South that are fighting to raise that wage level within the national context. But with the end of the Cold War, that logic has to change, right? And we do see the ascendancy of neoliberalism. So I'm curious how you see the logic of unequal exchange shifting with the end of the Cold War, and what role the United States has played under the kind of modern neoliberal era to enforce unequal exchange.
Yes, what happened in this period was that we got neoliberal globalization, and it changed a lot about unequal exchange. Well, unequal exchange disappeared, and even talks about imperialism disappeared actually already in the 80s, but certainly in the 90s. Nobody was talking about the imperialism anymore. They were talking about globalization. But this doesn't mean that unequal exchange disappeared and diminished. On the contrary, unequal exchange expanded huge in this period because the productive forces have been developed in the 70s and the 80s. We have got the cell phone, the internet, the computer capacity. We have got new logistics in form of the standard container and a lot of things. So the development of the productive forces made possible this huge outsource of industrial production from the global north to the global south. Before that, the unequal exchange have mainly been between raw materials and certain agricultural products from the third world exchanged by advanced industrial products from the global north. But now, with the neoliberal globalization, industrial production was outsourced to the global south en masse and in huge quantity. And this expanded the size of unequal exchange very much. But it also changed some logic in the unequal exchange very, very much, because there was this underlying logic in unequal exchange that it also generated overdevelopment and underdevelopment, because unequal exchange assumed that there was a need of a geographic link between side of production and side of consumption. Emmanuel argues that the market in Dar es Salaam is very, very little, so no one wants to invest in industrial production in Tanzania. So they invest in industrial production in Germany or in Canada, where the market is huge. So this was the argument. But with the development of the productive forces and the outsourcing of industrial to the third world, we can see that capital now has the capacity to control and manage production globally. And it also de-linked the geographic necessity between nearness of side of production and side of consumption. Now you could produce with low wage labor in the global south, and you could consume in the global north, where the wages were relatively higher. So certainly we saw this development of industrial production and development of the productive forces in the global south. And this was the beginning of huge problems for unequal exchange. that we see this transformation. If we go back to the 60s and the 70s, where these national liberation movements in the third world have got their national sovereignty, many of them, they really wanted to continue this national liberation into an economic liberation from capitalism. But they didn't have the economic strengths, they didn't have the diversity of their economic, they didn't have the development of the productive forces necessary to make this delinking. The market forces of capitalism was so strong that they would push back to capitalism. And at that time, the Soviet Union had already economic problems, and they were certainly not the most advanced industrial nation, so they could not support the third world in terms of developing their productive forces. They could only kind of balancing the US on the military level. They could not assist the third world in their economic development. So when the third world demanded another world order in the 60s and the 70s, it was completely in wane. But neoliberal globalization, yes, it expanded the unequal exchange, the size of the unequal exchange, but it also broke this 200-year spell of unequal development. It suddenly developed the productive forces in the global south. But of course, the news of this development, in order to cut the links to imperialism, it needs a political will to do it. Because if it's just capitalism as in Indonesia or in Mexico, well, unequal exchange continue. But if these countries have their own national projects, it's very, very different. And therefore, China is very different from what is going on in Mexico or Brazil or Indonesia.
I think we'll probably want to close by asking about, national projects and resistance at the level of the nation. But I did want to just follow up on one thing. So, you talked about certain technologies as, being kind of part and parcel of neoliberal globalization. You mentioned the shipping container, right? Something that makes transaction costs, the cost of actual circulation, go way down, which, has facilitated the expansion of unequal exchange in ways that you've detailed. But I'm curious if you have thoughts in terms of bringing it up to the present, right? We have new technologies, and I'm thinking about artificial intelligence that have likewise shifted the terrain in terms of where certain things are produced. I think a lot of the contemporary discussion around AI focuses on the risks of automation or, questions of like information control. But it seems like there's also a very concrete political economic dimension that connects to your work on unequal exchange and imperialism, right? Because the systems, the AI systems themselves, rely on these enormous global infrastructures around mineral extraction, energy consumption, unpaid labor, and very uneven ownership systems. So yeah, I'm curious if you have thoughts about how AI fits into this question around global value transfer.
Yes, because we have to see that unequal exchange have, of course, changed its forms and context through the development of capitalism. It started under colonialism with colonial product, with exchange with industrial products, and then it goes through the neo-colonial period, and then it goes into neoliberal globalization, in which production itself was globalized. And it's not only trade of finished good, but it also production change. I have this figure of the sour and the smiley in the cover of the book, which shows the value transfer by unequal exchange through a production change of an iPhone or so on. And recently we have this new wave of information technology and artificial intelligence, and this also have new forms of unequal exchange. Of course, there are also the old forms which are connected to artificial intelligence, because it needs lots of computer power. It needs supercomputers and huge machines, which takes up a lot of power of batteries, and it takes a lot of raw materials and rare earth and copper and a lot of things which are still exploited in normal unequal exchange by low-wage workers in Congo and other countries. So there are artificial intelligence are, as you mentioned, connected to all forms of unequal exchange. But we also see that capitalist artificial intelligence is aimed at the displacement of high-paid labor and replacement by a combination of machines automation and very cheap labor globally outsourced. The big IA companies are hiring in huge numbers low-paid machine trainers and images taggers, and in this micro-task platform function at the world market, they have platforms where laborers in Nigeria and Bangladesh or in many third world countries, they can hire them on these platforms. They are called click workers and microtaskers, and they are extremely low wages. And there are actually now millions of workers in low-income countries in Pakistan and Indonesia and Nigeria who are getting jobs on these digital labor platforms and give their work and their skills to the big global north artificial intelligence companies. And thereby they are bypassing the cost of foreign direct investments and transnational labor migration and so on. They can just be hired where they are, and they can sit in their location and be hooked up to the internet and perform this kind of labor.
I wanted to close out by asking about national resistance movements like Dylan was talking about. I'm wondering how you see the Yemeni blockade in the Red Sea, and in turn, the Strait of Hormuz blockade, both of which, at least according to this peace deal, may be ending within the next few days. How those fit into this relationship of unequal exchange. Because something that Emmanuel talks about in his writings in some places are his hopes that there will be third world movements to break these kinds of supply chains to the first world. And are these blockades a fulfillment of that hope in some fashion, or is it a more complex situation?
Well, it's a complex situation, but generally I think that the situation is much more positive than it was in the 60s and the 70s. Many people are saying, oh, you were lucky in the 60s and the 70s because the national liberations movement, they had a clear socialist perspective at that time, and the revolutionary spirit was so big at that time. And yes, that is correct. But the objective position and the possibilities for a transformation from capitalism to socialism was not very good at that time. And we can see that the revolutionary spirit was not enough, and that capitalism has many cards to play. For instance, neoliberal globalization. Today, the situation is very, very different. Capitalism is in a huge crisis. For the first time in 200 years, we have seen this break in the polarization of the world system. We have seen a country in the global south, China, rise. It's a huge part of the world system. China is not only the biggest industrial producer in quantitative terms, it has also begun to be in qualitative terms. China is leading in many high-tech productions as well. And in that way, the situation is very, very different than it was in the 60s and the 70s. And of course, as we go through the current situation, it's no wonder that precisely the Middle East and Iran is the epicenter, because this area is the swing door between the world of production, which is Asia, and the world of consumption, which is the Western world. And also in terms of energy, the oil goes through both through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea, and also through the Hormuz Strait. So this corridor is of immense importance, and therefore we see this struggle. And it's also therefore that the Palestinian struggle is still so vital. The Palestinian state in itself, it's no problem for imperialism. The problem with the Palestinian state is that it's in contradiction with a Zionist state, with the Israeli settler state. They are arguing about the same area. And Israel is very, very important for imperialism because it's a garrison state. It's a watchtower of the Western world controlling this area. So it's therefore this area is an epicenter for the geopolitical struggle at the moment. If we are looking at what is going on, I always take the analytic spectacles of the principal contradiction. I think if you want to make an analysis of the current situation, you have to start with the principal contradiction. If the world economy is accumulating on a world scale, and if we have had this many, many waves of globalization, I think also political, we can see the world as one process. And if it's one process, then it have a principal contradiction. And this have changed through the history of capitalism. But at the moment, I think the principal contradiction is between the declining US hegemony and the rise of a multipolar world system. It doesn't mean that a multipolar world system is a wonderland. A multipolar world system has also its contradictions. But the main contradiction at the moment is between US declining hegemony and a multipolar world system. And in this contradiction, Iran is a support, the Iranian regime is a support of a multipolar world system, and a US victory over the Iranian regime is a support of US hegemony. So in that sense, I support the Iranian regime. It's not my comrades. They have killed communists. But in the principal contradictions, they are from a multipolar world system. This way of analyzing can seem cynical and some kind of difficult to accept. I think one of the prime example of using the principal contradiction is Mao in 1937 in Yan'an, when we have the invasion of Japan. In that situation, Mao said that the principal contradiction is now between China as a national state and Japan. And then he accepted a united front with Kuomintang. And you have to remember that Chinese communists have fought a life and death struggle with Kuomintang for 20 years. And they have killed, Chiang Kai-shek have killed thousands of communists. But in that situation, the Chinese Communist Mao chose to make united front because at that time, the principal contradiction was between the Allied forces, which was the Soviet Union, American, and England and China, and on the other side, the Axis forces, Japan, Germany, and Italy, and so on. And by doing this, Mao not only secured the liberation of China, and later on the communists could overtake China, by making a united front and fighting the Japanese, he also hindered that Japan could attack the Soviet Union from the back, as the Nazis was attacking them from the front. And if Soviet Union was being in that situation of double attack, I don't think they could win over Nazi Germany, and the Second World War would have complete another solution. So you can see the impact of this decision by Mao in 1937 has a huge impact on history.
Torkil Lauesen, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you.